Good afternoon and welcome back after lunch. Glad to see so many in here. So we're back on track timing-wise. We have a half an hour panel discussion now on the common challenges in creating a data governance model and establishing a CDO role. So we have three intelligent people with us here to help us answer those questions. So just like last time, we're going to run through a couple of questions that we've gathered from you guys beforehand, and if there's a bit of time at the end, we'll open up for live questions, so to speak. So for starters, I'm going to sit down, but please introduce yourself. Start with
David, sure. So my name is David. I work for a fantastic footwear company. I'm sure you're all wearing my shoes. It's called the Aldo Group. We are in about 100 different countries, operating through wholesale, retail. Obviously, e-com is one of our big channels of distribution. And I've been with this company for a little over 4 years. I manage their data governance, their master data, their business intelligence, and the advanced analytics functions across the world.
Thank you. Nicola?
Hi, my name's Nicola Askham, and I'm really lucky. I do my dream job, and I actually get to help people do data governance in all manner of companies and cultures. So I'm very, very lucky. I've been doing data governance for over 15 years now. Including being a permanent employee of a company, working for 2 consultancies before becoming independent. So say I'm just very lucky. I always get to help people do the thing that I'm the most geeky about, which is data governance.
Excellent. Yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Andy Joss. I'm Head of Solutions and Data Governance for Informatica, which is obviously one of the sponsoring partners here today. My territory is Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Latin America, which, as you can imagine from a data governance viewpoint, means I get the good, the bad, and the ugly in terms of how people are doing it today.
Who's the good?
We'll leave those alone for now.
I'm more curious about the bad.
Let's try it. Okay, so let's start off. Perhaps a little bit of a big question, but if we're getting started, where do we start? Can you share some best practicing on setting up a data governance model, and what does the organization look like? I know it's a big one, but share some thoughts and best practices.
So I think I've seen a few things I think work well. This is not to say that it works for everybody, but I think it can potentially work quite well. For me, I think understanding what actually we're trying to achieve with data governance. I've been to lots of organizations that says we're doing it a bit like people are saying we're doing AI. The first question I always ask is, well, why? What is it you actually want out of data governance? A lot of my customers are in financial services. That's kind of my background. For many of them, it's about compliance. For me, actually, data governance is kind of much larger and much broader than that. It should be about empowering the organization, empowering employees to be able to use their data for the benefit of the organization and also their customers. So I think data governance is quite a large topic. So for me, collaboration across the organization, organizations that can get their business community and the non-data community actually engaged around data, I think is actually a materially good thing to try and achieve. It's hard. Yeah, I absolutely get that. The bigger the organization, the more diverse, the more challenging that becomes. But getting people to buy into why we're doing it, what it means for them, and actually that's a little bit about a different language. Mm-hmm. So rather than talking about what data governance means to the organization or the data governance team, what does it actually mean for the people who have to engage with data and actually the consumers of the data?
It's a change process, it's a change management.
Absolutely.
Set up some measurable goals, perhaps.
Absolutely right, I agree. Yep.
Nicola?
Well, I think Andrew summed that up really, really well. I think the one thing that I would say is I get quite a lot of emails and LinkedIn messages that say, can you give me a template for a standard data governance framework? And I think the one thing is that there isn't one. And if anybody tells you there is one, tear it up and do exactly what Andrew's saying. You've got to spend the time up front working out what's in it for your organization, why you need to do it. Because if you're doing it just because it's best practice, it's not going to work. There's a story that I tell, and I think some people in the room have already heard it before. In the early days of doing data governance, when I probably didn't really know what I was doing and I made every mistake in the book, one of my colleagues called me a data princess. And I went, oh, that's really nice. I quite fancy being a data princess. That's a really glamorous role to have, isn't it? And then my friend looked at me and went, he doesn't mean it as a compliment. And I went, oh. Oh, and then I just suddenly had this kind of awakening, and I realized that he was right. I was standing at the top of my ivory tower saying, we should manage all our data, and it's best practice, and you should come and do it because I say so, and nobody came. And I realized that you can't do it for best practice. You've got to find the genuine business value for you to do it and work with that, and that will then allow you to design the right framework for you.
Can I just jump in on that? That's a really, really good point. It's actually, this is just an example. So I went to, it was a central bank of a country, and I was talking to the lady that was responsible for delivering the data and the figures to the bank's board. And she had to do this on a daily, weekly, bi-weekly, and monthly basis. And clearly, the bank's board is determining monetary policy for an entire country of quite a lot of people, considerably more than half, probably about half of Europe in terms of the number of people. So for her, absolutely, the confidence in the data that she was giving to her board that has direct influence over the people's livelihoods for such a large country, that's a massive pressure. That was her driver, was about giving data to her board and saying, I have confidence that when I give you this data, whatever decisions you make, I need to know that the data is the right data, it's good data, and hopefully, therefore, you make the right decisions for it. So sometimes the consequences can be very big.
But I think it also really starts with understanding what data governance is. So I think a lot of where you need to start when you want to build out this data governance program, it's an education journey. You'd be shocked at how many people just have no clue what data governance is, or rather what it is not. And they go down a certain path and want to mimic, like you mentioned, best practices and best practices. But what is best practices? It's actually the right practices for your organization that you want to look for. But the only way you're going to get there is if you have the people at all different levels of the organization understanding what it is. So I believe that it starts a lot with education.
So continuing on that, what does it look like from an organizational point of view?
In terms of how you structure it and how you build it out?
Data governance model.
So again, I agree with Nicola on this. There is no one framework that you can apply to every single organization. We were talking about this earlier. I'm in a fashion company. So the model that I will apply in my organization is going to be very different than the model that would be applied in an insurance company or a banking industry, which is going to be much more, potentially at the beginning anyways, based on defensive strategies. Whereas in the retail world, I need to create value, I need to sell, I need to understand my customers. So I'm going to be more applying an offensive strategy in terms of data governance as to how I'm going to be leveraging my data and educating people on the usage of it and the processes around it.
Okay, but let's put it this way. Where does it sit? Does it need its own, is it its own organization? Does it have its own manager? Does it sit under the CIO?
That's still it depends.
That's going to be, yeah.
Can we have somebody else?
So anybody else wants to answer? So it'll depend on the company. It'll depend on your business model, or rather the industry that you operate in. Data governance needs to be very, very close to the business. It is a business function. The question is, what line in the business is it going to be fitting it under? In my case, for the Aldo Group, we have it underneath me, and I report into strategy. For us, data is a strategic asset, and we need to treat it as a strategic asset. It needs to be aligned to our corporate strategy. So we've decided to position all of my different functions, from artificial intelligence to BI and data governance, underneath corporate strategy, which for us works. But for a company that's going to be more maybe operations driven, it might make more sense to have it within operations. It's going to depend.
So let me rephrase it this way. Does it need a CDO? Is there a CDO role?
Is there a CDO role?
Yeah, Chief Data Officer.
It does not need a CDO. CDO is a new role that was created, and it exists in a lot of organizations. It doesn't exist in most organizations, mind you. But do you need a CDO to drive data governance? I don't think so.
I think
we don't have one, and we drive it.
But you need a champion, though, don't you? You need someone who's going to stand up and say, in terms of whether they report to the board or not. And I've seen CDOs, some that do report are genuinely board members, and they're driving an agenda which sometimes is very top-down through the organization, which again I think will reflect in terms of how you structure the organization. I've seen people who effectively are doing that role, the data champion, if you like, for the business, maybe having a completely different title, sitting somewhere down, lower down in the business, but they're champions of driving change through that business. And I think that, for me, is kind of the common start point, is who is going to be championing this? And that comes back to well, what are we trying to do in the first place to understand what the champion's trying to achieve with it? Would that be fair?
Yeah, and I think I had a similar question at an event last year, and I got shouted down because somebody said, where should you sit the team? And I said, To be fair, wherever it works, I'd say not IT if you can avoid it, because as quite rightly David said, it should be with the business. But apart from the not IT, and I tried to do somewhere central, but somebody said, you're wrong because you didn't say they should report to the CDO. And I said, well, the thing is, I can honestly say of all the clients I've worked with, not a single one has a CDO. But every single one of them has a senior executive sponsor, who is the one who's saying, I've decided we're going to put in place a data governance framework. So I'm kind of, you need that senior person, but it doesn't have to be called CDO. If you have one, definitely have data governance reporting to them.
Like when we started off data governance, when I joined my company, I reported into the CFO, and he was the initiator of this journey to bring in some data governance. And it was a senior leader, about as strong as they get in a lot of organizations, and that's what you need. You need that proper executive sponsorship. But again, does it have to be a CDO? No.
Okay, but most commonly, where does it sit? IT? It's under CIO or CFO? You guys have been out.
So where I've seen it sit a lot, unfortunately, starting off under IT is a place where you'll see it, or sometimes I've seen it start off a lot under a CFO because, let's be honest, finance is always very concerned with regulations, but that goes back to having a defensive data strategy and a defensive data governance program. When you start to evolve out of that defensive state, that's when you may move to somewhere else. In our case, we moved out of the defensive mode and really wanted to start tackling data as a strategic asset, and therefore moved it under strategy.
I've seen it in financial services sit very well under risk management, so a chief risk officer. And then everywhere else, it just really does depend, kind of thing. I've seen a lot, it's funny because in financial services, you tend to have a strategy director, but they're only one person, they don't have a team, so that doesn't work for them. But I've been doing a lot of work in the higher education sector this year in the UK, and that's often coming out of their planning, so again, their strategy side of things. So it's kind of see who feels the most pain and who's willing to kind of get it started and be open to it might move and sit somewhere else. When I first did data governance, I think we went through 3 different reporting lines in the first year while we were trying to work out where we belonged in life.
So, I've got a slightly different look on all of this because obviously I work with lots of different types of organizations across lots of different industries, and I think the point about financial services, I think risk, maybe compliance, operations, finance, I think are quite common in financial services. I think the one that stood out for me was a CDO who actually reported to the chief executive of the company, which is an ideal place to be in some respects. It also means you've got nowhere to hide, which is both good and bad, I guess. But for me, what was really important in terms of what he was trying to drive as an agenda was actually to make sure that everybody in the organization, from the CDO downwards, knew that they had to be doing something different. And they were in a massively competitive situation. And their competitive situation meant that they either had to do something or effectively they would just be running their business into the ground. So part of his role was really to convince the chief executive, the way out of this situation is not just by trying to make what we make a bit faster or with cheaper components, because of course we can do that, is actually to use the data we've got to be more intelligent about what we design and build, how we go to market, and how we sell it to our clients. So actually that worked extremely well, because actually what then happened is during meetings, when this particular CDO was talking, he wasn't just talking as an individual, as the CDO, he was effectively talking as a proxy for the chief executive, which of course gave people a bit of a different focus.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so it sits where it sits. But when it's there, how can we measure it? Can we measure its effectiveness, its ROI?
So I think ROI is a really interesting one, and I absolutely think you can. I think there are different stages at which you would want to try and measure ROI. I think the first one is actually in the early stages of delivering data governance, and that's normally to try and convince people that this is just a good thing to do. So I've actually got one of my customers, for example, their chief data officer is driving a data governance program with the objective of actually empowering the employees of their organization. It's a financial services company. They're a very large organization, so that's quite a tall order in terms of what that particular person's trying to do. So actually for them, actually being able to make a very large number of people more efficient in their day job, well, they can monetize that, and actually then using data in a much more offensive way rather than a defensive strategy, completely agree, they can start to monetize that too. So I think in the early phases of convincing people, I think you can monetize. I think you do get to a stage sometimes where people just have to take it a little bit on faith. And that's sometimes in that kind of trough that you sometimes get with new technologies. But actually, I think that to start small, focus on delivering something that has some value that you can then go and sell the heck out of to people to say, look, okay, we're maybe on step 1 or step 2, but look, it's working and it's driving value for the organization. Then I think people would find that a little easier to consume.
Yeah, think big and start small, as always.
Absolutely.
Nicola, you want to comment on the ROI bit?
Yeah, and I agree. It's very, very hard because sometimes some of the business case that I've seen people come up with is this won't happen. But people say, well, it might not happen anyway. And I've also worked with organizations where people say, but we're really, really successful as an organization, and we've done that in spite of our data, so what's data governance going to give us that we don't already have? So it's challenging, and you can do it. And I think I agree with Andrew, and I go looking after what I call, and I apologize, I'm spoiling my later presentation, but I go looking for data quality horror stories. So they might have already been fixed, whether the right way or the wrong way is kind of irrelevant, but there is usually a real impact that can be measured and used to say, well, look, this has already gone wrong, and something like this might happen again in the future if we don't start to manage our data more proactively than we do now.
Thank you. Did you want to say anything? Yeah,
sure. So I was thinking a little earlier when your colleague was talking about the 360 view of the customer. And the 360 view of the customer essentially gives you an ability to bring in all of that customer data and start to use it in an offensive manner, to start to segment your customers a little bit better, to be able to personalize your offers to them. And you can measure the benefits of doing this. And we have measured the benefits of doing this. And this is driven by our data governance strategy and what we want to accomplish in terms of data quality. If I don't have that proper quality of data, then I may not be able to target my customer properly. If I know what the value is of having one clean customer record, it is super easy to go back and then measure what is this program delivering in terms of value for my company. Not in terms of, I won't get sued under GDPR, so I'm saving 20 million euros. Rather, I am generating this much more money than last year because I went down this data governance journey.
Can you put a number on that one clean customer record?
So it depends on the company that you're going to work with. I don't know that I can give you an actual number legally, no, but depending on the company, an email address that's valid is going to generate anywhere between $2 to $4 a year. That's what you need to expect. I'm not going to tell you exactly what the number is in our case. We're a private company. I can't share necessarily all the details. But think about that. $2 to $4 a year. If you have 25 million consumer records and 10% of those are wrong, do the math. Your data governance program is paid for in full.
So just to kind of pick up on that point, I mean, I think sometimes it's also about helping particularly or senior executives understand and give them what I call the aha moment. So I'll give you an example. I was with an insurer, and this is all around data quality. And the type of insurer where actually they had teams of people who were busy physically keying in orders, and they physically had pieces of paper and scans of pieces of paper. So you can imagine what the quality of the data was like with some of that. But actually, if you look at the way the data the team was measured, it was measured on processing orders, not on the quality of data. So to do that, the system that they were entering the data into had so few quality controls around the data input, you could have entered kind of almost anything. But actually what we did is we just sat and worked with the organization to say, well, let's just understand the downstream impact of just something as simple as some of the errors that turn up. And actually what we started to discover is that these errors were being picked up by people in the business. So in the insurance business, people like actuaries and underwriters are very, very expensive resources. They have a day job to do, and they were spending the time fixing data quality problems. So you could start to measure that. And then the data, when it ended up with the senior executives, they were starting to make decisions about the direction of the company based on things like their sales and their revenues. They were making reports to regulators based on their internal finances. And yet they were now starting to question, well, actually, do we have confidence that we're making the right decisions for something as simple as these data quality errors? So actually, we actually worked out that the cost of fixing the data quality problems at source by getting people to do the right things was probably in the hundreds of thousands. I won't give you the entire numbers because that's not up to me. But as it went through the business, actually having the wrong people fixing data quality, underwriters and such, that was costing them multiple hundreds of thousands. And by the time it got to the board making incorrect decisions and actually potentially incorrect statements to the regulator, although they hoped they never got to that point, it was actually then running into the millions. So this potentially can be quite significant if you can trace through the impact of some of these things.
Okay, so we have a governance model in place. It sits where it sits. It doesn't need a CDO, and ROI is not an issue. Now, our only remaining issue now is to involve and empower our business users, who obviously need to do a lot of work. How is that done? It's a change management process, we heard, but any comments on that? How do we involve them? Do we need any tools in place, or?
So for education, I think it's the education that David said up front. And when I do my training courses, I say, look, these are the types of role, and I call them different things for different cultures, but these are the kind of roles. But actually, you have the ones that everybody's familiar with, like data owner and data steward. But I actually say that isn't nearly everybody in your organization either using or producing data? So I like to give them a role in my data governance framework, and that just means that I have an awful lot of work to get to everybody, depending on the size of the company. And that is, and that's where it's not particularly a tool, it's a working out how you're going to get to them using every communication channel available to you in that organization. And I will talk to anybody and everybody to get the message out there, even starting with the HR lady who runs the induction training, and say, I'm not expecting you to give them a day's data quality or data governance training, but I just want you to say, we manage data as an asset here. If you've got any questions about it, this is who to go to. Just start dripping the message in absolutely everywhere that people need to think about their data and who to ask if they've got any questions.
And saying that, but for that to work, you have to have management buy-in. You have to have the CEO right behind you. Well, that will just not fly, will it?
Yeah. So, the actual educating everybody, for me, normally comes a little bit further on once I've at least got some very senior people engaged and we've got permission to get going.
So I think it's a very interesting topic, the whole change management piece, and how do you bring people on board, and how do you make sure that they're living this data governance journey with you. It's easier to do when you're talking about your head office colleagues. But when you think of a retailer that has, potentially thousands of locations across dozens or hundreds of countries, well, not hundreds, but over 100 countries, then you're starting to have a little more complications into how you reach all of these people, and how do you ensure that the sales associate that's working in a store in Dubai when your head office is in Montreal is capturing the data for your consumers in a way that is going to ensure that you can then run those personalization algorithms and those segmentations. I think that's where the big challenge begins. But to be able to address those, to go to your point, it's getting all those, that senior leadership involved and have them be the ones that are driving the message by explaining to them what's in it for them. The sales associate in the store has an objective to reach their quota for the week, to reach their sales targets, etc. They don't necessarily care or understand that capturing this email address properly at the store is really going to generate more revenue for them, because there are statistics that we've concluded to that show that if we market to consumers, they will come back to the stores if we market to them via emails. So the associates in stores, by capturing that email address, not only benefit the e-com platform, but they also benefit themselves. And once you start to explain that and to show the value that you're driving for them, remember, it's always about what's in it for them when you're talking about change management. You're going to be able to get them onboarded with you into your data governance journey.
And I think, just to kind of add to that, and I agree with everything you've just said, David, I think for me, the one thing that we can potentially start to layer on that, I think there's a bit of change in ourselves. And I think that kind of centralized, we know what's best around data, it pervades in some organizations, and certainly people out in the business are thinking, well, this is my business, actually this is my data. I understand what it is. Do I understand what it means for me? So I think the point about being relevant for people, I think, is really important. But I also think we need to give people a way to engage. So I think there's a place for process and structure. There's definitely a place for tools. The one thing I feel has some mileage to come yet, I think, is this whole notion about getting the people out in the business to collaborate with the governance team. And what I mean by that is we need to make it easy for people out in the business. So if they find something's wrong, or if they need something, or they don't know what to do, or they need to go and do something that's specific around data, they have the right tools to either self-serve, if possible. And if they can't self-serve these things, because clearly everybody wants to get on and do their day job as efficiently as they can, who do they go talk to? And if they talk to somebody, is something going to happen about it? I think we can give people some tools to do that, but give them the confidence that actually do it yourself through self-service. And if you can't do that, there's a team of people you can rely on to do this. I think that would be big steps forward.
Okay, thank you. So it is obviously a change management project, and it's all about creating a sense of urgency in a normal change management.
Agreed.
Thank you. We have a couple of minutes left, and we can open up for questions. And you are indeed the fastest. I have a microphone there, or I'll just sort of walk over there. That's quicker.
Hi. So you all mentioned that the data is at most times close to the finance function at heart, and that the CFO, well, most of the times wants to be included when you talk about data. When we talk to other companies, we hear that, well, the CFO has a lot of mandate and a lot of interest, but maybe not always the experience with data and understand the whole data governance, the data platform journey, and all that. So without a CDO and the CFO right below the CEO, how do you establish the kind of influence within a sponsor? Yeah. Do you understand?
Yeah, so you're saying essentially, if I can just paraphrase, make sure I understood, the CFO who is not an expert in data governance, how can they run the program if they don't have a CDO reporting into them, right?
Yeah, or run the engagement.
Or run the engagement.
Yeah.
So when I look at sponsorship, I don't necessarily look for someone who's going to run the program or any of those things. That's my job. You have a data governance manager, you have a senior director of data governance and analytics or whatever, but you need one. Yeah. You need somebody that can run the program for you. Yeah. We're saying it doesn't necessarily need to be a CDO, but you can't have someone that doesn't know anything to data governance run a data governance program.
And you need management buy-in, of course, to support that.
But the sponsor, the CFO, what that person was doing for me was supporting me in ensuring that I have the open lines of communications, that I have, the ability to challenge the way processes are being done, or to support me in any of those policies or processes that we were going to be changing and updating. But that's where you need that sponsorship, that strong leader that can drive it for you.
Okay, thank you. Let's just hold it there for a second, see if we have any other questions. And if not, I'll let that discussion continue.
Well, I'm just pushing this because I'm really curious. If you're blank, if you don't have a data governance program, you don't have an officer of data, you don't have a director of BI and data governance, how would you go about doing so? Get the engagement from the CFO, the epiphany that data is the new raw oil.
So I still agree with what David's saying. Somebody has to start it, whether they are the senior person that's going to sponsor it. But I think if perhaps it's you, this is me making an assumption, but I think you've got to do that groundwork and research and work out what perhaps some of the drivers are so that you can engage the CFO and explain to him why you need it, and then agree whether either you're brave enough to want to run the data governance program, or whether you appoint somebody else to that. But I think that first step is somebody's got to work out what's in it for your company as a whole, and then to make the case to proceed and get into a bit more detail.
Where does that usually come from? Who has that clarity? Who has that view? Is it the CEO? Should be the CEO.
Should be. I don't know that it always is. You'll have that coming from different places. Sometimes it comes from IT. IT just keeps on just fed up with fixing data problems in the system and dealing. No, it's true. That's oftentimes where you'll hear a lot of that coming.
We're going to close there.
So can I just add,
yes.
One technique I saw with a couple of my customers is when they were in that kind of situation, is sometimes you can be the internal voice of data's the new oil, the internal voice of data reason, but you just don't get ignored. So you get ignored because you're kind of internal. So actually what I've seen a couple of my customers do, don't listen to us, go listen to people like Gartner. And Gartner will tell you that for your industry, how on earth could you possibly run your industry in 2019 and 2020 if you don't have data governance? So maybe look to a trusted third party who can then start to give you the pressure then to people above you, and then you're then the person that can come in behind and say, remember that conversation you had with Gartner? Well, actually, so how do we work together to pick that up and make it real?
Or you send them to events like this.
Events like this is another good way of doing it.
Thank you very much. Round of applause for...
Thank you.